following program is presented by the Theosophical Society in America, a worldwide organization dedicated to the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. The Theosophical philosophy offers a comprehensive worldview to the end that we may better understand ourselves and our place in the universe. Death and Dying, a Theosophical Perspective, is presented by Mrs. Dora Kunz, President of the Theosophical Society in America. Mrs. Kunz has had a lifelong association with the Theosophical Society and has served as President of the American section since 1975. Her expertise in healing and paranormal diagnosis is widely acknowledged. She has been involved in death and dying research and counseling for over 50 years. Mrs. Kunz.
Today, I'm giving a talk on the theosophical perspective of death and dying. And I think I will begin this talk by mentioning two books. The first one is called The Transition Called Death by Charles Hampton and is published by the Theosophical Publishing House. It talks about the experiences after death from this theosophical point of view. The other is Life at Death, Near-Death Experiences by Dr. Kenneth Ring. It is one of a series of books by different psychologists and medical doctors describing their research in hundreds of cases of people who have apparently died and come back to life. There is a great similarity in all of these books, but from my point of view, Dr. Ring's is the best. I would like to read the end of his book. And these are his conclusions. I do believe that not just on the basis of my own or others' data regarding near-death experiences that we continue to have a conscious existence after our physical death, and that the core experience does represent its beginning, a glimpse of things to come. I am in fact convinced, both from my own personal experiences and from my studies as a psychologist, that it is possible to become conscious of other realities, and that the coming close to death represents one avenue to a higher frequency domain or reality, which will be fully accessible to us following what we call death. This is the theosophical point of view exactly, practically, and thus I thought this would be an excellent beginning from this description. From the theosophical point of view, what Dr. Ring calls the core experience, which is that when a person dies, he or she goes through a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel, he experiences great light. This is part of that core experience, and this very definitely is in rapport with the point of view of theosophy. What we also feel, because I think theosophy is a scheme which goes in greater detail than these other books, is that each person is a soul, and that the soul goes through this recurring cycle of life and death many times, because reincarnation is part of the Theosophical philosophy. In the Western world, it is hard to conceive that really the majority of people think and accept reincarnation, because Buddhists, Hindus, and many other religionists accept this idea as a matter of fact. Now, from the theosophical point of view, which is the subject of my talk, when a person, in other words, goes through this experience of this contrast, one might say, between life, which is often, before one dies, concentrated in pain or difficulties, the contrast between this world and this other dimension of consciousness is really expressed by light. Another fact which is really described by those people who've had this previous experience of coming back from death, it is that they express the desire not to come back to this dark world, that they would prefer to stay in this other experience. Another experience, which is in all books practically is, and which is described in detail, is that when a person dies, he describes in detail that he is surrounded by those who have passed ahead of him. This is one of the most interesting descriptions of how they feel about it, because they really feel the sense of happiness. Now, to come back to the theosophical perspective, we feel that when a person dies, he, of course, he is fully conscious in this other dimension of reality, as Dr. Ring describes it, that he is aware not only of those who have passed on, but he or she is aware, and this is the difference in suffering between those who are here, staying behind, and those who lived in this other life. They are aware to a certain extent of what is going on. I would also like, I think this is an interesting point of view which has been written up in many, many books. And this is the sense of time. There are actually thousands and thousands of cases on record where people, when they are still alive, have had a dream, they have had an experience, in other words, of being warned that their death is ahead of them, or that somebody else will have this experience. And from this, and from the experience that when a person dies, they see the loved ones, I think those people have a different sense of time, in that they know ahead, in other words, what is going to happen to those who are still alive here. This, or in all religions, in all cultures, this fact has been brought out. Now, therefore, when a person dies, they can see and perceive what is happening here, and the great suffering is for us here is that we do not know and have lost contact with those who have passed on. But those on the other side have the suffering that in many instances there is no way of being able to reach those here for one reason or another. One being, I think, that we have a closed consciousness of it. I always say, a friend of mine in a college sent me a telegram once. And what she said was, she described how her little boy had been killed in an accident. And she said, "Dora, what can I do?" And that is very different from most people, isn't that? She didn't think of herself. She said, "What can I do to make my little boy happy?" And I want to speak about this. I think the acceptance of death is unavoidable. But if we can think of it in terms, even if we are not aware of it, of sending at this difficult time for both a sense of love and wanting to help, whatever the circumstances, I think after a while that sense of loss would not be so great. I think in this other world, this other dimension, people do continue their existence. I believe myself that in appearance, that there isn't such a great difference. But I think one thing which we can take for granted, don't you think, when we think of ourselves, we never think of ourselves as sick or old. I mean, we probably never think of ourselves in our visual images, the age which we actually are. And therefore, those who have passed on, I think this is a factor, they never look quite the same because they look much more like what they feel like. And so very often there is a great difference between what people look like here and on the other side. Because with the death of the physical body, there is or should be no pain. There should be no suffering, because finally the difference between the two domains is those rules which condition our life. They're eating, don't have to eat, and these tremendous strictures of time. I'm recurring to that theme, but think of it. I know I have to get up, or I think I have to get up early in the morning and go through all the strictures of doing things at a certain time, and I think that applies to all of us. And this does condition our mind, doesn't it? I don't think that we realize how we are conditioned by that. And those on the other side, very, very slowly, get a different sense of time, because that is removed. But also, I think the past and even a sense of the future becomes part of the conditioning of those. There is a different dimension in time. Don't have the time to go into it, and there again, I use the word time in the wrong sense. Beside that, there are experiences. People can communicate with one another. There is learning is possible. And I believe the one passion which people have all across the world is to travel. And the difference in both communication and locomotion is this. In locomotion, there is no gravity as we know it. And thus, what is important is how you feel. And your desire, in other words, to go somewhere else is a strong motivating force, and thus there is that sense, it's an analogy, it's absolutely nothing but an analogy of floating. That doesn't have to be that sense of walking. Communication, people still, I think, communicate in language. We are conditioned by that, but part of the communication is again at a different dimension. I think all of us have this experience. Today, we are not very honest with one another very often, are we? And we consciously and very often unconsciously try to fool one another. And we may feel angry and we try to hide it. Isn't that true? But if you have read something about the subject of telepathy, the direct communication of what you feel is still possible. You can perceive if somebody is angry, whatever they see, you're aware of it in particular. Now, in this other world, I don't think you can fool one another, because the sense of what that other person is actually feeling is very strong. I think this makes it clear. There is a much more direct response. And in this world, I would like to mention one aspect. There's a tremendous lot of suffering, and we may not be in a great war, but we are going through periods of constant little wars, and we are also going through periods of great violence in all the cities, and this death is everywhere. Not only natural death, but violent death is very common in the world everywhere today. Now, I believe and I know that people, when they are dying, some people really want to help. And I think those who die in violence, in suffering, there is a band of people, in other words, who learn to help others in that way. It is possible. So it isn't a duplication. There is a certain, in analogy, a duplication of what is going on here. I think there are different stages in life after death. Some of them are somewhat similar to what is going on, and in others not. I think an appreciation of music is possible because there is sound. There are many similar experiences, and yet they are dissimilar. It's impossible, really, to talk except partially in analogies. But I do want to point out that there is, I think, a closer kinship between those who have passed on and others. I want to talk again about this theosophical idea about reincarnation. And I always tell this story because it actually happened. I was in St. Louis at one time, and there was a big story in a newspaper. They gave the last words of a man who had been condemned to death, and he was going to die in the death cell the following day. And they asked him what did he believe. And he said, many people have come to talk to me in these last few days or hours, but I'm going to believe a guy, he said, who told me about the idea that he believed that there was this idea of reincarnation. He said, I'm going to die with that thought. I've done many things wrong, but I like to believe that I have another chance to do things right. That made the headlines on the day I happened to be there some years ago. And I think, therefore, it is a basic theosophical concept. The basic theosophical concept is that there is a period. Today, the word is very, very common. I think you read about it in novels, in all sorts of things, that there is an astral world. So let's call it that. That people live in this dimension, as Dr. Ring says, for a certain period of time. In other words, that people have to learn their relationships. And I think, for instance, if people are very closely linked together, a husband and wife, for instance, I think they are likely, in other words, to remain, one of them is likely to remain in that other world till the other person dies. Am I making that? I think finally, close personal links still persist. But there are also other lessons a person can learn in this other world. From the theosophical point of view again, there comes a time when some of these personal relations have been worked out. What do I mean by the word worked out? The happiness, the suffering in different personal relations. And they withdraw into another dimension. In this dimension, I think a person goes through a period. I think it is not a period, I am using an analogy again, of such active participation or such active communication with those they love. What they are living is really a period where they are digesting, that's a peculiar way, but it's just as good a way of putting it, their life's experience and life's relations, in other words. And most of those are not, what is not emphasized in that is the negative aspects, but the happier aspects. What you have learned, I hope, it isn't true always, learn something out of our relationship with one another. It is one of the greatest things we should learn in life, but sometimes we don't. Then from this perspective, there comes a time, as we believe in reincarnation, we also believe that reincarnation in time is relationships. I mean, I've stressed relationships, haven't we? I mean, we are here, we work out relations, our suffering, our happiness, all of these have to do with relationships. And thus, what we feel is that the time comes that the things you've done, like take our murderer in St. Louis. He felt that he had not worked out many things. Thus, that there comes within him the level of the soul, a time to come back to this earth, come back, in other words, in different relationships with people, in other words, but the whole plan is to work out a better perspective. Thus, to sum it up, is that from the theosophical perspective, the basis of what we think is that birth and death is a cyclic process which we go through many times, but that each one of us basically, and I'm using this word again deliberately, although it has so very little meaning, that we, each of us, have that immortal principle which we could call a soul. That is a part of us which really learns through these different experiences. That we have to learn through our relationships of love. If our relationships are based on hate, they're just as strong as the relations of love. They're just as binding. Until we have learned, in other words, that love and hate really have to be eliminated. That you can face your problems from this point of view of have a long perspective. And if something happens, which shall happen to all of us, that we'll lose somebody whom we love, that we follow the example of my friend who said when she lost her boy, 12 years old, what can I do to show my love to him? I think this is the most important thing to think of death. Thank you.
Dora, I wanted to ask you, going back to Dr. Ring's book, where he speaks of the core experiences that people who are dying go through, and they speak of the light. From the theosophical point of view, what is that light, and what happens to the soul or the consciousness or the immortal principle when it goes into that world of light? Does it merge? Does it retain individuality?
I think the world of light, it's just that we are always have part of that consciousness in this world, but at death there is a shutting off of the full focusing of that consciousness from being aware of our physical world. And the tunnel is, I think, the experience of shutting off the one experience of consciousness and transferring it to this other dimension of reality, which is really the main characteristic of that, at first glance, is that of light. And the thing about the question about the soul, it is the cutting off of one experiencing and the focusing again of its full perspective of in this other dimension. And so I think it would be quite normal to have, here you are, you go through a tunnel, and this is the darkness, the cutting off. I mean, if you really die, all his core experiences, there are people who came back. But in the real sense, there would be really a cutting off from one experience and fully focusing in that other dimension of consciousness, the astral world, if you like.
Yes, I have two questions for you. First one is, if a person or a soul moves through this tunnel of light when physical death occurs, does the same thing happen during the reverse process at birth? And different religions believe that a person could reincarnate in their next life either as a bird or an animal or even as another person. What is the theosophical response to these ideas?
I think the tunnel of light, I think we shouldn't take too closely as being an actual experience. I think in some form it is very often experienced, but I don't think that you should take it too literally myself. And about the soul, what the person experiences, of course, you really, when you are alive, I don't think that you experience consciously the idea of soul. You consciously experience that you are living in this physical body. Now, I think when you have passed on, you consciously are aware of what you are experiencing, what you are happening to you, but you're not necessarily always connecting it with the idea of soul. Now, at rebirth, personally, it is an allegory again, that a person is for a moment much more consciousness of being in that world of soul, dimension of consciousness, because it is assuming partly the burdens of a new life and a new relationship in which it has some experience, some relationship. What we feel in the Theosophical teachings is that it has some decision, in other words. It isn't only something which is unalterable and is destined for a person. And about the reincarnation in a bird or animal, this is definitely not the Theosophical point of view, because Theosophy believes in evolution and does not feel this is possible.
You said that love as well as hate must be eliminated. Would you explain that a little further?
Yes, that is. I didn't mean to say that. What I said is the love or the hate. Hate, of course, is a very binding relations, and the love, I didn't mean should be eliminated. I think, but love I mean is the kind of love which is also very binding, very possessive, which also gives great suffering, isn't that so? If people do not follow what you like doing, this, I think, is a personal identification of the self. But if you have the love, which really loves and thinks of the other person, I don't think that is binding. But the personal, the possessive love is a very binding and narrowing experience to go through.
In the case of death during an accident or after an accident, as opposed to natural death, is it not more difficult for the person on the other side to orient themselves in the new experience as opposed to normal death?
I think there is some truth in that there is greater difficulty in orientation, and I should think that it would take time, in other words, for a person to be in balance and to feel at ease with a very quick change of relationships, which he can see. I mean, the people on this side are thrown out of balance, and that you have to take that. Besides your total not expecting it, I think would have your suggestion of disorient.
Dora, you said that very often individuals who have near-death experiences don't want to come back. Is there a specific purpose to each individual's life that draws them back?
This is the experience which has been really described practically in every book which has recently been published. The people who were dying were called back because they felt, the people, their children, somebody in great need, or they just felt impelled. I don't think they sometimes felt it was their decision, but they felt they had to come back without knowing why. I think this, if you read the books, is a common denominator. But in some cases they felt the great need of the people who were here, that they could be of some service to them.
Dora, you mentioned the astral world. How does that compare or relate to Orthodox ideas of heaven, hell, and purgatory?
I suppose the purgatory idea, the way I personally have been brought up and all that, is completely, from my own conditioning, unfamiliar. But I would say that when people go, for instance, when they die with drug habits, when they die and have these cravings, that they go through a sort of purgatory, and it's an analogy, because it is not only the physical attachment, but it's the emotional suffering and dependence which makes people take that habit. And I don't think just the mere process of dying and not being able to satisfy cures the craving and all that. So I think until one understands it, it is going through a sort of purgatory. I think that's all I could say about heaven. Maybe this period which I described very briefly, between reincarnation, where one really digests, you might say, the learning and the good experiences, would be an analogy to heaven, where one is really experiences those levels of or dimensions of consciousness.
For those of us who will in the future be in a situation with someone dying, my question is, what can we do to help the person who is dying in the household?
I think the most useful thing, the most useful act we can do is to surround people with your feelings of love, to give them this sense, whether they believe in life after death or not. If they get the sense of your continuity of love, am I making it? It's a continuity. They're afraid that they will be separated from the love, not really the physical part of it. If they can experience that before dying, I think they die in a peaceful state of mind. And therefore, if you can also let the people go, I mean, in your own heart, because you have accepted that their time has come, and so the time of both of you have come, you are building a bridge of peace when they get into the other world, instead, very often, as it happens now, of senseless suffering. Isn't that true? I think it's very, very helpful to have that than dying.
The Tibetan Book of the Dead is said to give instructions for how to live in order that one may die better. Will facilitate this transition in the wider consciousness. Is there anything we can do in life now that will help us reach this larger perspective and make it easier for ourselves?
I should think the thought of acceptance, which would take fear away, wouldn't it? I mean, it is amazing. In my long life, and I've talked to people, it is the fear. A lot of people you wouldn't expect to have the fear of dying, have the fear of dying. And if we think of dying as inevitable, and when my son was very little, people used to phone me, and he heard me speaking over the phone about people who were suffering. And he always yanked at my skirt and said, "Mother," he said, "tell them that they are living in a world of light." In other words, if you can bring up your children with that idea, and that's really preparing it, that what we have described, that death is a natural process and that there is a world of light. Everybody is naturally going to miss somebody who has passed on. I mean, that is natural. But the acceptance, and I think the acceptance at all time, is preparing for it, not the terrible fear which many people have that this is extermination.
Dora, do you think that on the astral plane that we have the ability to understand foreign languages?
There is something in that. I think one can, because did I not say earlier that telepathy was the method of communication. And we often turn to think in terms of mental images. And so the mental images you get, and they get transferred into language in your own brain. Am I making that clear? So that is much more. I think this is enough. Thank you.
The preceding program has been made possible by a grant from the Kern Foundation. For further information on Theosophy and the Theosophical Society, write to Post Office Box 270, Wheaton, Illinois 60187. Books on the subject of death and dying are available for loan by mail from the Theosophical Society's library.